Today's episode is as frightening as it gets, and as freak an occurrence as you will likely ever hear about. But it happened in mid-air. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. NLM Cityhopper Flight 431, a Fokker F-28 regional commuter jet in the Netherlands, ran into a line of thunderstorms shortly after takeoff from Rotterdam Airport, October 6, 1981, this day in weather history. So I think we have all suffered that flight that is turned into a sick bucket nightmare as the plane hits particularly harsh turbulence. I remember once being on a transatlantic flight as a kid when, while returning from the washroom, our jumbo-sized KLM 747 dropped flat and straight down. Well, I bounced off the ceiling and landed in someone else's seat with them. It happens, and pilots are trained to do everything to minimize the discomfort. Modern radar and weather analysis instruments make it almost impossible for severe events to happen unless they come out of nowhere. 44 minutes before takeoff. This is during the regulatory weather briefing that took place. The crew was briefed at this time about an area of strong thunderstorms that was in their flight path. 5:04 p.m. NLM Cityhopper Flight 431 takes off from RTM. 5:09 p.m. The crew received clearance to avoid an area of heavy rain embedded within a line of thunderstorms that they had observed on their onboard weather avoidance radar. The pilots, of course, now worked to avoid the building storm. While they were struggling, a gap closed in around them, and the plane began being batted around violently by extreme gusts. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. 5:12 p.m. All of a sudden, a single massive critical gust slams hard into the plane. The plane was simply not strong enough structurally to absorb this mighty and sudden force. It tore the right wing clean off the plane in mid-flight. That was it. The Fokker F-28 regional commuter jet was sent tumbling from the clouds and crashed into the earth. Sadly, none of the 17 people on board survived the crash. And it was not immediately known how or why this plane just dropped from the sky like this. I mean, was it a microburst? That's common and has resulted in fatal crashes. So just what force could have swatted the plane out of the sky so abruptly? Turbulence can swat planes around. Like I said off the top, we've likely all experienced that to varying degrees of intensity. But could turbulence really be to blame for this tragic and fatal accident? The investigation was underway immediately as families demanded answers. But as the story came together, it became clear that NLM Cityhopper Flight 431 had encountered something far deadlier than mere turbulence. It did not take them long to find the horrifying reality of the rain-wrapped tornado being the culprit. There was a tornado reported on the ground that coincided with the location of the jet at that time. The tornado had already been cleaving its own path of destruction across the Dutch countryside in the minutes leading up to the plane's crash. It was concluded afterward that the sharp increase in altitude registered on the plane's altimeter was actually not a change in altitude. It was in fact a pressure drop associated with the tornado itself. This is the proof that the plane was literally inside the belly of that beast, and the extreme pressure drop from this tightly wound area of low pressure center was picked up by the plane's own onboard instruments. Then what happened to that wing that dealt the fatal blow? That's where we look at the downburst or microburst that lasted only a few seconds. The immense stresses experienced by the airframe from this sudden force is what caused the starboard wing to suddenly break off in the event. This day in weather history. Tomorrow is October 7th, and we are going to look back to when the weather was too clear too unseasonably mild and too sunny for a marathon in Chicago. On October 7, 2007, the LaSalle Bank Chicago Marathon had to be suspended mid-run for the first time in its history, with hundreds of runners suffering along oven-hot streets, resulting in heat-related illnesses. That doesn't sound like what they signed up for, that's for sure. We're going to review the details of that coming up tomorrow. It's right here on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.